She stood there, frozen in place, as the cashier announced her card had been declined. Again. The line behind her grew restless. The weight of all those eyes burned into her back as she fumbled through her purse one more time, knowing there was nothing to find. Have you ever felt that moment when the world seems to close in around you? When a simple trip to the grocery store becomes your personal nightmare playing out in public? The young mother's face flushed red as she glanced back. At her cart, milk, bread, eggs, baby formula. Necessities, not luxuries. Her 3-year-old daughter tugged at her sleeve, unaware of the quiet catastrophe unfolding. "I'm sorry," she whispered, ready to abandon the groceries and what little remained of her dignity. That's when it happened. Man, mid-40s, ordinary in every way, stepped forward without a word. No grand gesture, no announcement. He simply handed his credit card to the cashier with a slight nod. The mother opened her mouth to protest, but something in his eyes stopped her. Not pity. Recognition. As if to say, "I've been where you are." What would you do if a stranger stepped in during your darkest public moment? Would you accept the help, or would pride make you refuse? In that fluorescent-lit grocery store on a Tuesday afternoon, something extraordinary was set in motion. A chain reaction that would eventually touch hundreds of lives, all because of a simple, wordless act of kindness. The cashier swiped his card. Approved. The mother's groceries were bagged while she stood there, tears welling in her eyes. Before she could thank him, he was gone. No name, no number, no way to repay him. Just a stranger who appeared exactly when needed, then vanished back into the anonymous flow of everyday life. What she did next, her response to this unexpected mercy, would ripple outward in ways neither of them could possibly imagine, ways that would eventually bring them back together under circumstances that would leave an entire community speechless. Have you ever wondered how many lives you've touched without realizing it? How many stories you've become a part of just by existing in the same space as someone else for a fleeting moment? The man, let's call him Michael, didn't think twice about what he'd done. For him, it was simple. He saw someone struggling and had the means to help. No cameras were recording. No social media post would celebrate his generosity. No one would ever know. Or so he thought. Michael returned to his apartment that evening, made dinner for one, and settled into his usual routine. A widower of 5 years, he'd grown accustomed to the quiet. His children were grown, living in different states, building lives of their own. His act of kindness was already fading from his memory, just another moment in an ordinary day. But for Sarah, the young mother whose groceries he'd paid for, that moment was anything but ordinary. Sarah tucked her daughter into bed that night and sat at her kitchen table, staring at the groceries he'd purchased. Food that would keep her child fed for another week, a buffer between desperation and survival. 3 months earlier, she'd been laid off from her job of 6 years. 2 months ago, her husband had abandoned them both, leaving behind nothing but bills and broken promises. 1 month ago, her savings had run out. That night, Sarah made a decision that would alter the trajectory of her life, and eventually, the lives of countless others. She took out a small notebook and wrote, "Grocery store stranger, payback plus forward." It wasn't just a debt to be repaid, it was a promise, a covenant with herself and the universe. What if the smallest acts of unexpected kindness carry the greatest power to transform lives? Not the planned, photographed charity that seeks recognition, but the spontaneous reaching out that expects nothing in return. Sarah fell asleep that night with something she hadn't felt in months. Hope. A fragile, newborn thing, but hope nonetheless. All because a stranger had seen her humanity when she'd been at her lowest. The next morning, Sarah woke up with a clarity she hadn't felt in months. She made her daughter breakfast, eggs and toast that wouldn't have been possible without Michael's intervention, and began making calls. Have you ever noticed how help often arrives right before you're about to give up completely? As if the universe waits until the final moment to throw you a lifeline. By noon, Sarah had an interview scheduled at a local cafe. By evening, she had a job, minimum wage, tough hours, but work nonetheless. The owner had been moved by her honesty about her situation and her determination to climb back up. "Everyone falls," the cafe owner told her. "Not everyone gets back up with such grace." For 2 months, Sarah worked every shift she could get. She picked up extra hours when others called in sick. She learned every aspect of the business, from brewing the perfect espresso to balancing the register at closing time. Her notebook grew filled with numbers. The exact amount Michael had paid for her groceries. How much she'd saved so far. How much more she needed. But Sarah's plan had evolved beyond simple repayment. She'd begun watching for others like herself, people struggling at the register, counting change, putting items back. There was the elderly man who didn't have quite enough for his prescription copay, the college student whose meal plan had run out before semester's end, the young couple counting pennies for baby diapers. Each time, Sarah stepped in, never with a grand gesture, never seeking thanks. Just a quiet, "I've got this," and a nod. Exactly, as Michael had done for her. What happens when gratitude transforms into action? When receiving becomes giving in an unbroken circle? Each act cost her extra hours of work, another line in her notebook. But each time, something inside her grew stronger. The shame of that day in the grocery store began to fade, replaced by something else. Purpose. And all the while, she kept her eyes open for the man who had started it all. The stranger whose face was etched in her memory. The person she now thought of not as a savior but as a teacher. Michael's life continued unchanged. Wake up. Go to work at the engineering firm where he'd been employed for 20 years. Come. Home. Repeat. Were you ever the catalyst for something extraordinary without even knowing it? Have you ever set something beautiful in motion and walked away completely unaware? 3 months after the grocery store incident, which he'd long forgotten, Michael stopped by the new cafe that had opened near his office building. It was a small place, warm and inviting, with the kind of character chain stores could never replicate. He ordered a black coffee and sat by the window, watching the world pass by outside. It was then that she saw him. Sarah, now assistant manager, recognized him instantly. Her heart pounded in her chest. For months she'd imagined this moment, rehearsed what she would say. Now that he was here, words failed her. She approached his table, coffee pot in hand, and asked if he wanted a refill. He smiled and nodded, not recognizing her at all. Sarah returned to the counter, hands shaking. She took an envelope from her purse, the one she'd been carrying for weeks just in case. Inside was the exact amount he'd paid for her groceries, along with a letter explaining what his kindness had meant to her. But as she watched him sip his coffee, lost in thought, she hesitated. Something told her it wasn't time yet. That there was more to this story than a simple repayment and thank you. Instead, she made a decision. She told the owner that Michael's coffee was on the house. A regular customer appreciation, she explained, though he'd never been there before. What if our lives are filled with these invisible connections? Moments when we brush against someone else's story without realizing the role we've played. When Michael went to pay, the cashier smiled and told him his coffee had been taken care of. By whom? He asked, confused. Just to thank you for being a valued customer, came the response. Michael left, puzzled but pleased by the unexpected kindness. Little did he know, he had just been touched by the ripple he himself had created. A ripple that was growing into a wave. Have you ever noticed that once you start looking for kindness, you find it everywhere? That what seems rare is actually abundant, just hidden beneath the surface of our everyday interactions? Sarah's notebook had become a journal. In it, she recorded every act of kindness she performed, not out of pride but as testimony. Proof that small actions matter, that tiny seeds can grow into forests if given time. 6 months after the grocery store incident, she'd helped 37 people. Some with small amounts, a coffee, a sandwich, others with more substantial needs, a week's bus fare, a child's school supplies. Each action inspired by what Michael had done for her, She'd calculated that she'd now given to others 3 times what Michael had originally spent on her groceries. The mathematical debt was paid, but Sarah felt the true repayment had only just begun. One evening, as Sarah closed the cafe alone, a young man burst in just before she locked the door. He was drenched from the sudden rainstorm, desperate for shelter. Something about his frantic energy made her uneasy. "We're closed," she said firmly, one hand on her phone. The young man's shoulders slumped. "Please," he whispered. "I just need somewhere to sit until the rain stops. I've been walking all day." Sarah hesitated. Her daughter was with a sitter. She should say no. But something in his eyes, desperation mingled with resignation, reminded her of herself 6 months ago. What would you do when helping someone might put you at risk? When your instinct for self-protection collides with your capacity for compassion? 30 minutes, she said finally. "And you'll have to sit where I can see you while I finish closing." The young man nodded gratefully and sank into a chair. Sarah brought him a cup of hot tea and returned to her closing duties, keeping him in her peripheral vision. Slowly, his story emerged. Kevin had been homeless for 3 weeks, lost his job, then his apartment, was trying to reach his sister in another state but had run out of money halfway there. Sarah listened, recognizing the spiral that had nearly claimed her. When Kevin finished his tea and prepared to head back into the rain, she made another decision that would alter the course of multiple lives. She reached for her notebook. Michael's routine had shifted subtly. He now visited the cafe regularly, drawn by something he couldn't quite name. The coffee was good, yes, but there was something more. A warmth, an atmosphere of kindness that felt increasingly rare in the world. Have you ever been drawn to places without understanding why? As if some part of you recognizes something important that your conscious mind hasn't yet grasped? Sarah watched him become a regular, always from a distance. She learned his schedule, his order, black coffee, occasionally a scone. She instructed her staff to take special care with his orders, though she never explained why. Meanwhile, her kindness journal had led to something unexpected. After helping Kevin that rainy night, giving him enough money for a bus ticket to his sister's and packing him sandwiches for the journey, Sarah had started thinking bigger. What if kindness could be organized without losing its heart? What if the ripple she'd been creating could be channeled into something more deliberate? She pitched an idea to the cafe owner, a suspended coffee program. Customers could prepay for coffee or food for someone who couldn't afford it. The owner, impressed by Sarah's work ethic and heart, agreed immediately. Within weeks, dozens of sticky notes adorned a special board near the register. Single mom with little girl, coffee and muffin paid for. Student studying for finals, large coffee waiting. Having a rough day? This one's covered. The cafe became known not just for good coffee, but for its culture of care. Business increased as people came specifically to participate in the program, both as givers and receivers. Michael noticed the board one morning and read the notes with interest. Something about it stirred a memory he couldn't quite place. He added $20 to his bill. "For whoever needs it," he told the cashier. What if the universe conspires to bring together those who are meant to learn from each other? What if coincidence is just connection we don't yet understand? That afternoon, a reporter from the local newspaper came to do a story on the cafe's program. Sarah, now the manager, explained the concept, credit going to similar programs in Italy. But when asked what inspired her to bring it here, she hesitated. "Someone helped me once," she said finally, "when I needed it most. I'm just passing it on." The reporter took photos of the noteboard, the cafe, and Sarah. The story ran the next day on the local section's front page. Michael read it over his morning coffee, in that very cafe, unaware that he was staring at the face of the woman whose life he had changed with a simple, wordless gesture. The newspaper story transformed everything. What had been a neighborhood initiative suddenly gained citywide attention. Other cafes and restaurants began implementing their own suspended coffee programs. Local businesses reached out to Sarah for guidance. "Have you ever watched something Small you've created take on a life of its own? Grow beyond what you could have imagined into something that no longer belongs just to you? Sarah was interviewed on local radio, then television. Each time, she told the story that had started it all. The day her card was declined and a stranger stepped in without a word. "I never got to thank him," she always finished. "But I hope he knows what he started." Michael, listening to the radio one morning on his drive to work, nearly swerved off the road. The story being described, it couldn't be. Could it? The details matched. The grocery store, the declined card, the silent payment. But it had been such a small thing nearly a year ago now. He pulled over, hands shaking slightly as he turned up the volume. It was her, the woman from the grocery store, Sarah. She had a name now. And apparently his small gesture had meant far more than he'd ever imagined. What happens when we discover the impact we've had on others without intending to? When we learn that our smallest actions carried weight we never anticipated? Michael sat in his car long after the interview ended, remembering that day. He'd been lost in his own grief then. The anniversary of his wife's death. Helping someone else had been as much for himself as for her. A way to push back against the darkness that always threatened to engulf him on that particular date. He drove to work in a daze, the routine that had defined his life suddenly seeming insufficient. All day he thought about Sarah and what she'd created from his simple act. After work he went to the cafe hoping to see her. But it was her day off. Instead, he studied the wall of sticky notes that had grown to cover an entire section of the cafe. Hundreds of small kindnesses documented and multiplied. He left without saying anything to the staff. But this time, he left a note on the board. "To the woman whose groceries I paid for, I heard you on the radio today. What you've built is beautiful." He signed it simply, "The Grocery Store Stranger." Sarah arrived at work the next morning to find her staff clustered around the noteboard, whispering excitedly. When she read Michael's note, her hands flew to her mouth. Have you ever had a moment when the circle finally closes? When something you've been waiting for, perhaps without even knowing it, finally happens? "Is he here?" she asked, looking around the cafe. But of course, he wasn't. Just the note remained, proof that he was real, that he remembered, that he knew what had grown from his kindness. Sarah carefully removed the note and placed it in her kindness journal. Then she wrote a response. "To the grocery store stranger, your simple act saved more than my groceries that day. It saved my faith in humanity when I needed it most. I'd love to thank you in person. I'm here most days. Sarah." The cafe had become a kind of community hub. The suspended coffee program had expanded to include job postings, skill shares, and small fundraisers for locals in crisis. What had begun as coffee for those in need had evolved into a network of support that operated largely on trust and goodwill. Local. Businesses donated gift cards to be distributed through the cafe. A lawyer offered free consultations one afternoon a week. A doctor provided blood pressure screenings and basic health advice for those without health care. And through it all, Sarah's original mission continued, identifying those in immediate need and providing help without fanfare or recognition, just as Michael had done for her. What happens when kindness becomes contagious? When it spreads from person to person, evolving and adapting to each new circumstance? The City magazine featured the cafe in a spread about community innovation. This time, Sarah was photographed at the noteboard, Michael's note visibly displayed, in the center. She hoped he might see it and return. 2 days later, Michael stood outside the cafe gathering his courage. Through the window, he could see Sarah working behind the counter. The woman he'd helped almost a year ago was now at the center of a movement that had touched hundreds of lives. He took a deep breath and opened the door. The bell above the door chimed as Michael entered. Sarah looked up, recognition flooding her face. For a moment, neither moved. The space between them charged with the weight of their unseen connection. Have you ever met someone who changed your life only to realize that perhaps you changed theirs too? That what you thought was a one-way street of impact was actually an exchange? "It's you," Sarah said finally, coming around the counter. The cafe was busy, but in that moment, It might as well have been empty. Michael nodded, suddenly shy. I got your note. They sat at a corner table, two strangers connected by a single moment that had spiraled outward to touch hundreds of lives. Sarah told him everything: her job loss, her husband's abandonment, her daughter, the notebook that became a mission. Michael listened, amazed that such a small gesture had catalyzed so much. When she finished, it was his turn. I didn't do anything special that day, he admitted. My wife had died exactly 5 years earlier. I was just trying to do something, anything, to make the world feel less cold. Sarah reached across the table and took his hand. You did, and then some. For 3 hours they talked, piecing together the invisible threads that had connected their lives. The cafe staff covered for Sarah, understanding instinctively that something important was happening. What if our smallest choices are actually our most significant? If the moments we barely register become the hinges upon which other lives turn? By closing time, they had exchanged phone numbers and made plans to meet again. Not romantically, both were clear on that, but as partners in something neither fully understood yet. Before leaving, Michael handed Sarah an envelope. Open it later, he said. At home, after tucking her daughter into bed, Sarah opened Michael's envelope. Inside was a check for $25,000 and a note. Seed money for whatever comes next. This isn't charity, it's an investment in the vision you've already proven works. Sarah sat stunned, the check trembling in her hands. What had begun with a declined card at a grocery store was evolving into something neither of them could have imagined. She reached for her phone. 6 months later, the Ripple Cafe opened its doors in a previously abandoned building downtown. The concept had evolved. A cafe, yes, but also a community center, skill-sharing hub, and small business incubator all in one. Have you ever witnessed something grow so far beyond its origins that it becomes almost unrecognizable, yet somehow still carries the DNA of its beginning? Michael had become not just a donor, but a full partner in the venture, using his engineering and business experience to complement Sarah's vision and community connections. His retirement savings, largely untouched since his wife's death, finally had purpose. The grand opening drew hundreds: cafe regulars, local officials, media, and curious community members. Sarah and Michael stood side by side, watching in amazement as people flooded into the space they'd created. The mayor cut a ribbon made of suspended coffee notes linked together, a symbolic gesture that wasn't lost on those who knew the full story. The local news captured the moment, ensuring that the ripple would spread further still. What happens when private kindness becomes public inspiration? When a story touches people so deeply that they feel compelled to create their own version. Requests began coming in from neighboring cities, then from across the state. People wanting to know how to replicate what Sarah and Michael had built. A website went up. A simple how-to guide became a handbook, then a movement. Sarah's daughter, now 4, toddled through the cafe, high-fiving regulars who had watched her grow over the past year and a half. She would never remember the desperate times, the declined card, the stranger's intervention. She would grow up knowing only that kindness was her inheritance. Michael found himself with a second family, not replacing what he had lost, but adding to his life in ways he never expected. His own children, initially skeptical of their father's new venture, became supporters and occasional volunteers when visiting. The original cafe continued under new management, maintaining the suspended coffee program that had started it all. A small plaque near the entrance told the story of the grocery store encounter, though it omitted names to honor the spirit of anonymous giving that had been its foundation. 1 year to the day after their first real meeting, Sarah and Michael sat in the original cafe, marveling at how far they'd come. "Did you ever imagine?" Sarah asked, gesturing to a newspaper article about their 20th franchise opening in another state. Michael shook his head. "I just wanted to help someone get through a hard day." The movement grew, evolved, transformed. What began as suspended coffee became suspended opportunities. Job training, microloans, childcare co-ops, all operating on principles of dignity, accessibility, and community ownership. Have you ever stood back from something you helped create and realized it no longer belongs to you? That it has become a living entity with its own momentum and direction? 3 years after the grocery store encounter, Sarah and Michael found themselves on a national morning show, reluctantly sharing their story. They had declined dozens of interview requests before, preferring to keep the focus on the work itself. But as imitators and opportunists began co-opting their model, sometimes for profit rather than community benefit, they realized their origin story needed to be documented and protected. It wasn't about creating a brand or a business model, Sarah explained to the host and millions of viewers. It was about recognizing that traditional charity often preserves the very power dynamics that create inequality in the first place. Michael nodded. When I paid for Sarah's groceries, I didn't make a speech or ask for recognition. The power remained with her, to accept help with dignity, to decide what to do next. The host nodded thoughtfully. And you've built that same principle into all your centers. What if we've been thinking about helping others all wrong? If true change comes not from top-down charity, but from side-by-side solidarity? After the interview aired, their website crashed from traffic. Donations poured in, celebrities reached out wanting to endorse or contribute. Overnight, the quiet movement they'd been building became a national conversation. Sarah and Michael retreated from the sudden spotlight, focusing instead on creating robust guidelines to protect the integrity of their model as it spread. They knew that rapid growth without proper foundations could destroy everything they'd built. During this whirlwind, they received a letter from a woman in another state. Enclosed was a photograph of a young man in graduation attire, standing proudly outside a community college. "This is my son, Kevin," the letter read. The young man Sarah helped when he was homeless. The bus ticket she gave him got him to my home. The kindness she showed him restored his hope. Today he graduated with a degree in social work. He plans to work at a Ripple Center. The circle continues. Sarah showed the letter to Michael, tears streaming down her face. "This is why we do what we do," she said simply. Michael put his arm around her shoulders as they both looked at the photo of Kevin. "This is why we have to protect it," he replied. 5 years to the day from the grocery store encounter, Sarah and Michael stood in the auditorium of a university that had created a department dedicated to studying and teaching their model of community resilience. Have you ever recognized a turning point only in retrospect? A moment when everything changed, though it seemed ordinary at the time? 1,000 people filled the seats, representatives from Ripple centers across the country, academics, community organizers, policymakers. What had begun as a wordless act of kindness had evolved into a framework being studied and implemented in communities worldwide. "We didn't invent kindness," Sarah told the crowd. "We simply created structures that allow it to flourish without shame or hierarchy." The data was undeniable. Communities with Ripple centers showed measurable improvements in poverty reduction, mental health outcomes, and social cohesion. Traditional charities were adopting elements of their approach. Politicians from both parties pointed to their success. But for Sarah and Michael, the statistics weren't what mattered most. It was the individual stories. The single mother who now ran her own catering business, the veteran who found purpose teaching carpentry, the teenager who received a suspended college application fee and was now pre-med. What if the greatest change doesn't come from grand gestures or revolutionary ideas, but from simple human kindness reorganized to maximize dignity and opportunity? Sarah's daughter, now 8, sat in the front row, witnessing the culmination of a journey that had begun before she was old enough to understand it. Beside her sat Michael's children and grandchildren, now part of an extended family bound not by blood but by shared purpose. 5 years ago today, my card was declined at a grocery store, Sarah said, drawing her remarks to a close. I was at my lowest point, broke, ashamed, desperate. A stranger stepped forward and paid my bill without a word. He disappeared before I could thank him. She turned to Michael, who stood nearby. I didn't know then that this stranger would become my dearest friend, my partner in building everything you see today. I didn't know that his simple act would spark a movement. Michael stepped to the microphone. And I didn't know that helping someone buy groceries would change my life. As much as hers, I was just trying to get through another day without my wife. I was the one who needed saving. Together, they unveiled the new initiative, a nationwide network of community banks operating on principles of trust, accessibility, and human dignity. The final piece of the puzzle they'd been building for 5 years. As the crowd rose in a standing ovation, Sarah and Michael stood side by side, watching the ripple they'd created continue to spread outward in ways neither could have imagined, like, "This video, subscribe, and share your thoughts below." This channel is for those who believe in the power of small acts to change lives. Because sometimes, the smallest gesture can start a ripple that becomes a wave, and eventually, an ocean of change.